If someone tells you they had an experience with evil, would you believe them? Would you tell them it was probably the wind, or chalk it up to the atmosphere, or their mental state at the time? For these people, your opinion wouldn't change a damn thing. They still would have experienced pure terror. Enjoy. When I was a little girl, I had a dreadful bout of the flu, which left me feeling like I'd been hit by a train. My mother put me to bed and tended to me with bowls of chicken soup and iced tea. I slept a lot, and when I was awake, I read my books and cuddled my teddy bear for comfort. For the most part, I was miserable. After a few days, my mother called the doctor and he turned up with his bag of tricks. Having to swallow disgusting medicine seemed like hell, but that was nothing when something frightening happened to me. I've told a lot of people this story, and they always put it down to the fever, but somehow it seemed more real than that. I'm not usually a flibbertigibbet and prefer not to have people fuss over me, so when I slipped into a heavy fever, I tried to keep it to myself. I can't explain why, but I was embarrassed when I started sweating profusely in the middle of the night. I was worried that Mother would think I'd wet the bed, but then I heard something that distracted me. A guttural sound, like congested breathing, came from nowhere. Being congested myself, I thought for a while that the sound was coming from my own throat. Also, being like a scientist, I always had to test things, so I held my breath to see if the noise was something else. The sweat froze on my skin, and my hair stood on end when I continued to hear the rattling breath. I squealed, but still didn't call for my parents. Then I saw my breath coming out like cigarette smoke. At first I thought it was funny and kept deliberately exhaling strongly. But then I heard a nasty chuckle, which made me sit up in bed straight away. I could feel the chilly air and started to shiver as the chuckling voice continued. I was shaking so much as I reached to turn on the lamp. My fingers struggled to find the switch, but I froze when the chuckling stopped. Even though I was dizzy, I knew something else was in the room. Shuddering with fear, I couldn't believe that I was watching a black fog forming at the foot of my bed, illuminated by the streetlights from outside. I was finally able to flick the switch and the light came on, but the fog continued to grow at the end of my bed. I quickly drew the covers up and over my head, but I was still able to see, and boy, did I wish I couldn't see. I was petrified when I saw the black fog spreading like storm clouds under the sheets and headed toward me. Being a bit of a chicken, I quickly jumped out of bed and ran over to the wall, thinking that I was at the door. I scrambled to find the handle and could hear the ghastly chuckle behind me. When I looked over my shoulder, I saw a terrifying spirit in the fog, closing in. When I think of it now, it reminded me of a bully, one I'd often fought with at school. But at the time, all I knew was that I was being terrorized by the devil. When it got to me, I screamed and began clawing the walls until my parents rushed in. They grabbed me and pulled me away from the wall. I was delirious, so they took me straight to the hospital. My fever soon broke, and they settled me down enough to come back home. I never saw anything like that again. I remember everybody telling me that it was just the fever, but even when you're sick, you can still tell the difference between what's real and what's not, can't you? Over the years, I've gradually convinced myself that what happened on that day was nothing. But deep down inside, I know that if I'm ever deathly sick again, I'll probably see a familiar face in my final moments. After my divorce, I was at an all-time low and desperately feeling the need for solitude and introspection. Not having the accessible funds for a getaway, a work friend graciously offered her stone cottage in the woods. Being a 2-hour drive away, it was a welcome retreat, and I thanked her profusely for the opportunity to escape. Before I left, she dropped by to give me the keys. I was surprised to see her quite nervous as she handed them over. I asked her if she was okay, and she turned around before getting in her car, pursing her lips like she was conflicted. I should have told you before, but we haven't been there for 3 years. You might have to clean them a bit. I laughed and shook my head at her. That's no big deal, don't worry about that. She continued to stare at me. There's something else. She closed the car door and came closer to me. Some say that it's haunted. I laughed heartily at the absurd statement. Come on, you know I don't believe in that stuff. I'll be fine. I ignored the fact that she was shaking in fear. After a hug, I pondered the fact that my friend was so gullible and surmised that the cottage was probably just old. I arrived at the property around 5 on a Saturday night and had taken a week off to enjoy my welcome holiday. Driving up the dirt road toward the site, I noticed that it was nestled in the trees, with a storage shed out in the back. I also noticed the strange fog around the property, which had not been anywhere else on my drive up the mountain. I parked in front of the cottage and admired the stone work, which was built with rocks taken from the nearby river. The wooden door and shutters added a charm to the quaint shingles on the roof, completing the look. When I unlocked the front door and opened it wide, I was surprised with how sparse the furniture was. I was also surprised that the mess my friend had mentioned was non-existent, so I dragged my bags in and set up, happy that my grief over my divorce was suspended. I had a makeshift meal and settled in for the night. It took a while for me to realize that the usual sounds one might expect in the woods were absent from this area. As I lay in bed wondering why everything was so quiet, I heard soft footsteps coming from the main room. Then I saw dark shadows appearing under the crack in the door, while the footsteps multiplied and raced faster. I sat up and watched the flickering shadows, like black fire coming from the other room. The footsteps got louder. Getting out of bed, I took a step toward the door, but stopped when it slowly started opening on its own. The creaking of the door almost hurt my eardrums, and I shuddered as a cold breeze whipped up around me. Being able to see the whole room, I was puzzled to still hear the footsteps. Then I realized they were from the ceiling. Suddenly, unseen hands, more like claws, shoved me forward. I screamed and stumbled into the main room. I quickly spun around, just in time to see the bedroom door slam shut. Then demonic laughter froze me to the spot. I lunged at the front door, but was stopped by a large hand grabbing me by the hair. Then it jerked me upward into the air. Screaming in terror and suspended mid-air, my feet scrambled to find a footing and my scalp burned with pain. And I yelled, "Let me go!" as I dangled in the air. I was then viciously thrown across the room, landing on a chair. I then tumbled over it and felt sharp fingers clawing at my flesh. I yelled in rage, "What do you want?" I tried to get up, but was slammed back down again by powerful claws. I screamed my question again, louder this time. I nearly fainted when I heard the response.
"Blood and soul."
I fell back and twisted myself around, then quickly crawled toward the front door. The demonic laughter bellowed in my ears. By this time, I thought I was going insane. Miraculously, I was able to open the door and was soon on my feet, racing toward my car. Once I got to the car, I realized that I didn't have the keys. I fell to the ground, then turned to look at the cottage, sobbing and shaking. I saw what I can only describe as the devil glaring at me. For some reason, he wouldn't step over the threshold. So I crept over to the other side of the car and waited. The next thing I knew, it was early the following morning. I was freezing and my teeth were chattering. I slowly stood up and looked over at the cottage. The door was still open, but the demon wasn't there anymore. Even though I was freezing, I crept up the steps and peered into the cottage. The furniture was smashed and upended. Keeping my eyes on my purse and suitcase, I ran in as fast as I could and snatched them up, then ran for the door. As I approached the threshold, I heard a dark chuckle from somewhere in the cottage as a hand grabbed my hair. Not wanting to have a repeat performance, I surged forward and felt a clump of hair being ripped from my scalp. I ran to the car and threw my bags in, not even bothering to get dressed. I felt a trickle of blood run down my neck. It took forever for me to get the car started, and I sobbed loudly. Even though my anger was building to fever pitch, when the car finally started, I planted my foot on the accelerator and roared away from the cottage. Reaching around to feel the blood on my neck, I was baffled to find that nothing was there. My scalp was intact. I still have no idea what happened that day, but I'm sure I didn't hallucinate the demons in their terrifying attack. I was part of a cleanup crew when the city decided to tear down old buildings that had asbestos in the walls. The building I was assigned to was a toy store for at least 50 years. Once on site, I felt an unsettling vibe that was like a mixture of nostalgia and forgotten memories. There was something else in the mix which I couldn't put my finger on. Needless to say, it was creepy. I'd heard a lot of haunted stories, and until then, I never paid much heed to them. I was soon to be proven wrong. There were 7 of us in the crew, and after suiting up, we set off to our designated areas. Mine was the attic. I wasn't that impressed with my assignment, but I pulled my equipment up the stairs and prepared to work. When I first entered the space, I had to fight many cobwebs and a variety of boxes, crates, and cabinets. The prep crew had neglected to clear it all out, so I started to move and pack all the items. I tried to ignore the freaky giggles I was hearing, thinking that the laughter was either coming from downstairs or from the toys in the boxes. I soldiered on. It wasn't until a doll's arm fell on the floor right in front of me that I began to feel like I wasn't alone. I felt like it hadn't been thrown, but rather dropped from above. I looked up, but there was no way it had fell. There were only beams and roofing slats, nothing that the arm could have fallen from. It was confusing. As I picked up the arm and tossed it into the box, I heard a deep growl from somewhere in the back of the attic. I spun around and saw that something had disturbed the thick dust which billowed up in a big cloud. I yelled, "Who's there?" Silence first, then a cackle like an evil witch. I slowly crept toward the back. I stopped when I saw an old dirty doll with red matted hair, standing against a chest of drawers. The eyes were closed. At that point, I was losing my temper, even though I was still feeling uneasy. I stomped forward and snatched the doll up. I'd already decided to toss the doll out, but nearly fainted when the eyes suddenly flew open, then rolled back. I dropped the doll in shock, and then a moldy old monkey started clashing its cymbals. Childish giggling ensued. I was so angry I kicked the doll and threw the monkey in the trash, but then a small ball came bouncing toward me. I kicked that too, and felt like a frightened child having a tantrum. It was bizarre but very powerful. It felt like something was trying to overcome me, like a possession or something. That's when I heard more evil laughter. Now I was terrified and screaming, "Stop it! It's not funny!" Then a box fell off the dresser, and I started hearing whispers. "The devil's gonna get you. To hell with that." I ran out and resigned on the spot. I don't care what anyone says. You can't pay me enough to deal with that kind of thing. Well, what about you? What would you do if you heard an extra breath in your room when you're all alone that isn't yours? Or a retreat that turned into a night of living hell? Or quitting a job at the first sign of crazy happenings? Thank goodness everyone doesn't do that, or Flint would be an even bigger mess. See you next time.